Got it. Okay, and is Susan there? Susan, can you hear us just to be sure?
Yes, I'm here and I can hear you. Thank
Okay,
you.
perfect. I'm just taking a quick screenshot of us. So if you could get your camera on one more time, Susan. The panel familia. Okay, thanks.
Oh, it says Richard doesn't have permission. So Jimmy, you might have to hit
Got it. Okay, I'll text him one more time.
I think you might actually.
Oh, I just asked him to clarify.
Okay.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Oh, I see.
Cool. You were thinking about the local recording, right? HK?
No, are we now live as
We're live here, yes. We're just not going to broadcast through those other channels that we were thinking about.
okay, so okay, we're starting now then, right? So
Yes. Oh,
go
yeah.
ahead. Welcome everybody.
Yeah.
Jimmy.
Yeah. So let me do that. And cool. Yeah, welcome everyone getting in. Okay, I see some participants. Thank you so very much for joining us. We are going to allow for more folks to get in, and then we will start this program. Oh, I love that background as well, Vlad. Look at that.
Trying to keep it on brand, you know?
Okay, gotcha. All right, well, we are going to go ahead and kick things off because time is of the essence and we want to get to our panelists more than anyone else. That's for sure. And so we want to begin by saying thank you so very much for joining us on this evening. We appreciate your time in community with us and in dialogue with us. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join this discussion. We also want to wish a Feliz Dia de los Muertos for those celebrating. And we want to acknowledge that this can be a very trying time for communities all over the world, including in Los Angeles. We want to note that we pay our respects to all those going through the challenges of coexisting with each other on this planet. We certainly hope that today's discussion is a demonstration of our commitment to dialogue as a form of building bridges, as a form of healing, as a form of connecting our human experiences after all. So just want to make that note and thank you once again for being with us this evening.
Yes, this event, which you are all just thank you so much for joining us again. It's being hosted by Jimmy, who spoke just now, and myself, Helen. We are the duo behind K-Town Is Oaxacan Korean, which is also called K-Town Is Okay for short. All the panelists and hosts that are present today have embodied knowledge of living, working, playing, worshiping, and or going to school in Koreatown. The illustration for our event was provided by Mickey 100. She created this work as an homage to Korean American journalist K.W. Lee. Lee started his career in the early 60s covering civil rights struggles in the South, and he specifically asked, if not you, then who, in an article aimed at Korean American youth to raise their voices against inequality and racism. But Jimmy and I felt that it was a call that we can all answer, which is why we felt this was an appropriate title for today's panel. K-Town is Okay, and this panel are supported by Quienes tu Vecindario, a 501c3 organization. The mission of Quienes tu Vecindario, which is Spanish for Who is Your Neighborhood, is to uplift communities through creative and accessible arts and education programs. Our organization's name also highlights that it is people who make up a home, a neighborhood, small businesses, and other forms of placemaking. So please consider making a tax-deductible donation to Quienes tu Vecindario, which Jimmy will put the link to the donation now in the chat to support this panel and help create more such dialogue for our communities. Very briefly, I want to go over some housekeeping. This event is being recorded to be made available to the general public, and it's also being live broadcasted as of now. The video and audio functions will be turned off for attendees, but you are welcome to interact with one another through the chat function or submit questions to the host and panel through the QA function or the Q&A function. I'll mention more about that in a moment. I realize that this goes without saying, but we ask that you use considerate and respectful language when using the chat and the Q&A functions. Here is the lay of the land for tonight. First, we're going to provide a bit of context about Koreatown and K-Town is okay. After that, we'll have a one-on-one with each of our 4 panelists, Monica Garcia, Quasi Boyd Bolden, Susan Park, and Vladimir de Jesus Santos. As you can see, we have a packed schedule, so we unfortunately will not have enough time for audience Q&A. However, Richard, who is at the Zoom helm tonight, will be keeping track of your questions, and Jimmy and I will be considering them for future conversations, including ones that Jimmy and I have on our podcast, also called K-Town is Okay. We have a new episode every week, available wherever you prefer to listen to your podcast. And attendees of these events are automatically added to our mailing list, so you'll get an update on our next podcast episode, as well as how to further connect with our amazing panelists. So first, a little about K-Town is okay.
So K-Town is Oaxacan Korean. This is now a year-long project by yours truly, as well as Helen H. Kim, that we launched after tuning in to those infamous leaked recordings out of LA City Hall. And so what we did at that point was we decided that we wanted to call attention to especially this place known as Koreatown, because in between a few lines, Koreatown was mentioned during this private discussion between 3 LA City Council members and the Federation of Labor president at that time. And so we thought to ourselves that there was a huge misunderstanding and also distortion of the character of Koreatown that we needed to call attention to. But interestingly enough, at the same time in that conversation, there was a grain of truth, so to speak, this idea of Oaxacan Koreans. And so what Helen and I decided to do at that point was get into the shirt making process, because don't we love that? Now, before we delve further into the adventure from there on, I want to say a little bit about myself. So I am affectionately known, including on the podcast, as the Dong Sang. I am a native Angelino, born and raised in the city, and I am of both Oaxacan as well as Salvadorian descent due to Mama y Papa, who got here in the 1980s. So shout out to them. K-Town is okay, could not be here without them. And then I'm also a writer and the creator of Los Cuentos de Los Angeles, which is a podcast, among other things. Finally, I'm the executive director of Quienes tu Vecindario, the 501c3 organization supporting this event. Would really love and appreciate a donation to that, which goes to all of this. My collaborator in this work, my colleague, is affectionately known as the Nuna. She immigrated to the US in the 1980s. She is of Korean descent through her parents, and she's a community-based artist as well as researcher who's currently working outside of K-Town is Okay on the Relocation Lao and Korean Acculturation Project, a series of interviews on her end just as well, her and her colleagues' end. She's also the visual brand and designer under the name known as the Think Farm, and it was due to the Think Farm's design work that what you see on K-Town is Okay, the podcast, as well as through K-Town is Oaxacan Korean, the shirts, shines so well. This is Helen's background. This is where Helen is coming from. This is where Helen has been for a while. So Oaxacan Koreans, this is a phrase uttered by Gil Cedillo in a private discussion in October 2021. this was leaked a year later through the LA Times as well as Knock LA. And this led to protests. This led to a lot of outrage. This led to a lot of discussions about where LA would be headed, actually, because LA has this reputation as another city on the verge of collapse, especially due to all its multiplicity, all those differences, all those tensions. But what we decided to do was take that, hone in on it, and really honor, especially Korean and Oaxacan culture in K-Town, though not strictly Oaxacan and Korean culture in K-Town. So it gets multiplicitous. It gets a little complex out there. As noted here, we took that phrase, that singular phrase, and we said, K-Town, it is Oaxacan Korean. It's also more than that, but it begins to tell a story. And so here is the way that just a few words can go a really long way in describing a place, especially one that we know as affectionately as K-Town. The other major part about this, though, is that especially this neighborhood in Los Angeles is one that we feel any elected council member, any elected official anywhere should be familiar with. This is because K-Town, as well as especially South Central Los Angeles, figured prominently during the 1992 uprisings, as well as unrest, as well as Saigu, as it's known in the Korean American community. K-Town businesses took about 51% of the damage, according to some estimates. This led to foreclosures. This led to a whole lot of businesses lost into the wayside forevermore. This led to a complete change for the city of LA, if not for people hanging on to the neighborhood as they did and rebuilding to a significant extent. So going back to that same sense that KW Lee was describing, and going back to especially the commitment on those families who remained in K-Town and decided to rebuild alongside those allies and supporters, Koreatown's Oaxacan Korean is very much building on that legacy of taking something out of the ashes and recreating it for the record. Now, to be sure, a few historical facts about K-Town is that really the Korean American community in Los Angeles goes back to at least the 1930s. However, the K-Town that we know in central Los Angeles really saw its rise in the 1970s. It's less than 3 square miles long, and real estate development, as well as small business development, food, culture, that has played a huge part in remaking K-Town over the last several decades, certainly the last couple decades that we have been here. To be certain, it forms a part of the densest area in Los Angeles County, and as one of our interviewees for this series noted, it's the most dense area west of the Mississippi. People tend to think of New York in terms of density, and in Koreatown, we get as close to New York as you're going to get on the LA side. And our panelists can tell you all about that as people who have lived there and continue living there. And so again, over 1,700 K-Town businesses were destroyed during the 1992 unrest, riots, uprising, or Saigu. And after the 90s, K-Town became a little bit of a stop, but not necessarily some place that was truly invested in by our elected officials. No surprise as to how that led to the conversation that we referenced at the beginning. But in the words of Steve Kang at the KYCC, or Koreatown Youth and Community Coalition, elected officials would come around to collect campaign money for successful small business owners here, but K-Town rarely received any of that investment in return. So just facts about this place. Now, to be certain, once again, the mission of K-Town is Oaxacan Korean is to take this term that is based in discrimination, based in ignorance, based in division, and the zero-sum mentality, especially that is prominent in politics, and we're looking to flip that, really reclaim that, make it about understanding, love, and community more than anything else. We also make it our mission to document these stories, the stories of the people who live here, the stories of the people who have started small shops here, who are still looking for a place to live here, and so on and so forth. And we want to celebrate what is common between us or what we share, that is our similarities, as well as what makes us different, what actually makes us, our own complete unique people. We're not afraid of that conversation, and we want to approach more and more of the things that bring us together as well as what divide us. And with that said, we also want to note that, once again, this has been a year-long process of interviews. Here are 9 of the last people that we've interviewed since the start of this documentation series. And if you go to ktownisok.com, you can see our conversations with each of these folks, all of whom have contributed a unique set of words and notes for us to keep in mind about this place. Words that will tell you just as much as what we've described here and more. Shout out to Meli Cruz Bautista, who was our first interviewee. Steve Kang also had really great notes for us to keep in mind. Andrew Ann told us all about getting here in the early 2Ks. Yeah, just a decade after K-Town saw all these flames and starting up a small shop there. Sam Yu also told us about her father's business and how it might have only functioned in a place such as K-Town. Kimberly talked about green space, especially during the summertime, and how we need more green space in K-Town, among other things. And then Quasi told us a lot about growing up in this place through several decades and seeing the neighborhood change, including through school. Diana told us about all of the rise of unhoused tents in K-Town over the last decade especially, and how resilience is something we have to move past just as well. And Godfrey talked a lot about questions of public planning and how to build housing and how to build equitable policies into design practices for our city. And Susan Park gave us a great set of notes on just who felt that unrest and those uprisings in 1992, which is often forgotten in discussions about this part of LA. So you can learn more about these discussions, as well as other notes to keep in mind through K-Town is Okay, the podcast. As for now, we are going to move into our big Q&A session to say more about our panelists. And Helen, I'll hand it off to you for the start of that.
Yeah, thanks, Jimmy. I am so pleased to introduce our first panelist, Monica Garcia. Monica is both a storyteller and advocate for Indigenous communities. She grew up in Koreatown, but was actually born in what is now known as Mexico. She identifies as Native or Indigenous, coming from a long line of the Maya people and the Cloud people, also known as the Zapotecs. Monica's personal journey of understanding her layered identity informs her current training as an MFT student. So please welcome Monica.
Monica, it is so great to be sitting down with you and to be in conversation with you this evening, just to be certain. Oh, I saw you opened your mic up. And so once again, we really want to thank you for taking the time to be with us this evening.
Thank you, Jimmy, Helen, and the whole team of K-Town is Okay for the invite and for the space to share our voices and our stories.
It's our absolute honor. And of course, time is of the essence. So we're going to have a small session here, and then our goal is to get into a group Q&A. But the first question I'll ask you is regarding something we talked about when we first met and when we first connected for this project. So you actually mentioned to us during this initial convo that even since your youth, you actually identified not as a Latina, but as a Hispanic person at the time, but as Indigenous. So can you actually tell us a little more about this?
Yes, and I'll speak for my own personal experience because everyone's experience might be different. So I didn't really say I'm Indigenous because when you're young, like you don't really like identify yourself. You just are who you are and move the way you move, your people move, and that's just you. There's no labels as kids or growing up, right? We just know who we belong to, right? And so my family arrived to Koreatown in 1981. I was 4 years old. So in order for me to like answer the question, I need to provide a little bit of context. So we arrived to Koreatown in 1981 and I was 4. I remember when I was at that time, many folks from Oaxaca, specifically from our pueblo, were arriving, and we all arrived at a home where there was somebody there already waiting for us, a familiar face. You see, we have always been communal, and that continued with our arrival. I remember being the only child in the home, and many women and men gradually coming and moving in to that particular house and going, and new people coming in. Zapoteco was all I heard growing up. Even though my mother didn't teach me, she chose not to teach me. And nevertheless, that was all I heard. My mom would just speak to me in to my father and I in Spanish. My father was born in Mexico City, and even though his father was like also indigenous and Mayan, his father died when he was 10 years old. So he never really was able to live that indigenous experience and identity like I did, like growing up with all these people that were coming from El Pueblo. I remember experiencing how communal they were in cooking. All the women were together. There was communal cooking, communal problem solving, helping each other find jobs, even communal grief. I remember when there was knocks at the door, there was this sense of altered hypervigilance. At the time it was like, is it la migra or what's happening, right? So they would always take care of one another. And I just, as an only child full of grownups, this is what I witnessed and what I saw, the way they moved, the way they felt a sense of belonging or didn't feel a sense of belonging, the way they experienced life. So even though my mom didn't teach me or communicate the ways with me, I lived it, including the healing ways where someone was sick or out of balance, that we would use plantas, ancestral plants, smoke, mezcal to heal. I remember as a child, though, that was all the type of medicine I received. So I grew up witnessing all this. And
it's almost like there was a language of indigeneity without you speaking, say, Zapotec, even though that's associated with how you might identify as a person of that culture. But what you've described is a language, it is a movement.
Right. It was their own personal language. It was like, oh, this is how we're supposed to exist. This is how we're supposed to heal ourselves. This is how we're supposed to cook all together. This is how we're supposed to solve problems all together. This is how we're supposed to belong. I didn't necessarily understand the language. When I would ask my mom, she would just say, don't worry about it. My parents were very disconnected from me because, you see, we had arrived a year prior to the United States and they lost a child. So they left Mexico grieving. And on top of that grief, it was the grief of leaving their motherland. So it was just too much for them. My mom was 16 when she had me. So they were very disconnected, and their hope for me was just to assimilate, become as Americanized as possible. I don't need to learn Zapoteco. Like my mom didn't want me to have her experience, because prior to that, my mom had lived in Mexico City for 9 years with my dad, where she experienced colorism, racism, discrimination from Mexican people. So, and that really harmed her. Till this day, I can see that grief like appear till this day. And so, that left me just kind of like out of place, not knowing who I was. And I remember growing up, they were telling me you're Hispanic, because at the time that was the term. There wasn't like Latino wasn't like the term, it was Hispanic. And it didn't sit with me. Like I tried to assimilate into the American culture, I couldn't. I felt out of place. and the term Hispanic didn't sit well with me. Later on, the term Latino became popular. That still didn't, I don't know, I just didn't feel connected to it. At one point, I identified as Mexican, but I remember every year my parents would take me, once they got their green card, they would take me to Mexico's city, or sometimes send me by myself. And I remember my cousins from my father's side, they would talk about the indigenous people in a dehumanizing way, not as their, Mexican citizens like everyone else. They would say, oh, mira los inditos, like, look at the little Indians. And I remember that hurt me terribly. Like, and I felt like I don't want to be Mexican, and like, I don't know, I didn't feel part of that Mexican community when I heard that. I realized that my mom had transferred, without me becoming self-aware, her own grief and pain of what she endured in that country. Just trying to find my identity in my, because everybody at the time, it was like, okay, what are you? What are you? As you get older, then they start trying to label you and trying to make you label yourself. And I was just kind of like, and then in my when I went to college in my late 20s, that's when I started kind of doing my own research, like, of who I was, and tracing my lineage and my ancestors and their migration patterns and all that. And things started to make sense in the way that I perceived the world, and the way I connected with the environments, and the way I existed and I moved. I realized, like, it all came back to me, like, from my childhood, right? It was like my body remembered that sense of belonging, and how my people belonged. And then all of a sudden, I remembered something I had completely forgot. On one of my trips to El Pueblo in Solaga, my grandfather told me, he was the first person that told me who I was. He said, this is your home, estas son tus raíces. I remember I was 9 years old, but I had forgotten about that until I went back and did my research, because he was the only one that kind of welcomed me, like, as in, like, this is who you are. And oh, that gave me so much power. It brought me back home, and that's when I began to, I fully, when identify myself as Native or Indigenous.
Thank you so much for this, Monica. And what I realize is that, of course, we have so much to describe when such a seemingly friendly question, such a seemingly innocent question is actually posed. It goes back to what we've experienced since the outset. And so I appreciate your describing all of this. I think what we can also do is have a couple more minutes just to note what you think has shifted for people who identify as Indigenous in a city such as Los Angeles. We've got about a couple minutes just to describe that, but we can also get back to this in our group Q&A. I realize at this point. So in your opinion, what's something that has shifted for identifying as Indigenous?
I think now it's more like people reclaiming, especially people like me that not both of my parents identify as Indigenous. So, like, my mom wasn't understood, so she kind of didn't want me to, she's like, well, I'm not even understood in my own home with my own husband, and so it was hard for her to want to be visible as an Indigenous woman because of all she suffered in Mexico. So now there's, definitely it has changed. People are reclaiming their indigeneity. People are not allowing themselves to be labeled and to say, well, don't put us in a box, because there's so much to us. Even within our own Zapoteco community, there are so many variants of Zapoteco. And so I think that has changed, and I'm happy it has changed, like, for us not being afraid to use our voice, for us reclaiming our identity. It's like coming home, coming back to the origin. And yeah, I see that has changed. And I think something else we need to reclaim, well, specifically speaking me, is the language. So I understand I understand some of what my mom speaks with my grandma, and but I can't, and I can say some words, but my next goal is to speak it fluently. So just reclaiming the language, that's another one of
That's
my
right.
dreams.
That's right. So we will certainly return to our discussion. For now, you've really opened up a whole set of ideas for us. And so I have to thank you once again for your time. We will reconnect before too long.
Of course, thank you for your questions, Jimmy.
Thank you, Monica. Okay, so we are now going to move into our next Q&A. Once again, in the interest of reaching our collective or group discussion at the end of these. And I have the pleasure to introduce Quasi Boyd Boldine. Quasi, also known as Non-Standard on IG, is an artist and designer who grew up skateboarding through the streets of K-Town. He says that this taught him to view the urban landscape and city life in general in a new way. Quasi's multidisciplinary art practice continues to be informed by this intimate way of seeing as he documents the ongoing changes in the city of LA that have major socio-political implications. Quasi and Helen H. Kim, it is my pleasure to leave you to the floor here.
Hey, how's everybody doing?
Hey, Quasi, so good to have you with us. Just for context for everybody who are meeting you for the first time, can you tell us when you moved into Koreatown and how old you were?
Yeah. So can you hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. So basically, like, I moved to K-Town when I was 10. So that would probably be like around 1987. And before that, I'd lived in LA. I moved to LA when I was born in Brooklyn, but moved to LA when I was 2. So we got here in like 1980 at Union Station. But I lived in Hollywood, lived in Mid-City. But when I was 10 years old, that's when I moved to Koreatown.
And then, as I recall, you lived in Koreatown well into your adulthood, right?
Yeah. I mean, in a lot of ways, I'm still in Koreatown pretty much every week. I lived with my mom. From the time that I was 10 to the time that I was 23, I lived at my mom's house right off the corner of like Council and Normandy, so like right by Beverly and Normandy. And then when I moved out of there, I moved right over to near Oxford and Olympic, and where I lived for like another decade or about a decade, like 9 years. My mom and my in-laws still live in Koreatown, so we're literally there like every week.
So you have like deep history in K-Town.
Yeah, no, I've seen it go down. I mean, honestly, from, just, like I said, from that point, I've had a continuous view of it, and that kind of like reshaping and redevelopment and everything that's gone on has kind of driven like my photography and like my art and things like that too. But yeah, that's pretty much it's the part of the city I'm probably most familiar with.
Yeah, for sure. So then let's kind of go back to your childhood. So my understanding is that in your formative years, you grew up with fellow skateboarders and graffiti writers. And so I'm just curious to know, having lived in the city and been in that culture, and now as an adult art maker, do you feel like that LA that you knew growing up, that culture, which contributes to what's happening today, do you feel, well, I guess, how do you feel like that culture of that era is informing LA culture now? And how do you feel like it's being acknowledged or respected today in LA art and culture?
Well, you can see it because it's there, but it's always in the background. But in a lot of ways, I think that's how LA is. Like you said, like I grew up skateboarding. Like when I was 10, that was kind of how I got to know the neighborhood and my neighbors. We lived very close to Wilshire Boulevard, which was like the mecca for skateboarding at the time. It kind of still is, but like I mean, it was insane when I was skating. And so like that was just what we did all the time, like either after school, on the weekends. It was just like me and a bunch of neighborhood kids kind of doing that. And I think that because that was such a central part of skateboard culture, I mean, like professional skaters would come and like, there's videos and everything like that. A lot of the influences that dominated the scene at the time did end up kind of getting into pop culture, into streetwear, into all of these, sorts of things. Not many people from LA made a lot of money, or at least people that I skateboarded with or the people that I hung out with made a lot of money off of that. But it definitely is still something that you can see in popular culture even today, because the roots are there. Like that's where the roots came from. So in that way, it's still there, but also in a lot of ways, it's kind of missing, because like that vibe is not something that's easily identifiable. Like we were, I mean, when I grew up in Koreatown, like it was basically, there were a couple Black kids. It was mostly Latino kids. I had a bunch of Filipino friends. Of course, I had some Korean friends. I mean, but really, it was everybody from everywhere. Like there wasn't really like, the selection of friends wasn't really based on that. It was based on what you did. And that vibe was a very LA thing that extended to graffiti too. It was the same thing. Like if you were dope, you could be from a crew, and if you weren't, then you weren't. And like Koreatown was one of the places that had a lot of like mixed race crews. Like it wasn't all just like dominated by a single demographic or whatnot. So that part of it is kind of gone. I'm sure it's there and around in ways that I can't see, because I see it with my daughters and I see it with kids around, but I'm not a part of it. But that's the part of growing up in Koreatown I can say that it's hard to see in popular culture.
Thanks so much for that. I want to come back to that idea of like that multicultural or interracial space. But before I do that, let's get a little dark. I know that you were in middle school when the 1992 riots or uprising. Different people have different ways of talking about that or terming that. But you were in middle school when the unrest happened for 3 days straight, particularly in Koreatown. So I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your experience of actually seeing that in real time, and how that might have informed your current understanding of socio-political dynamics in LA today. It's kind of a big question.
Yeah, no, a little bit. But I'll do my best. No, I mean, I was really young when it happened, and obviously, my family, being Black, African American, we've been following, everything that had led up to the uprising for, very intently. But it was something that seemed kind of distant because it didn't happen in Koreatown, like and it wasn't part of my everyday, even though clearly I was, associated with that and like, with my, my family and things like that. So when everything kind of popped off, it was still, it popped off in South LA. So it didn't start in Koreatown. It wasn't until the next day where it really had kind of, or maybe it was 2 days or whatnot, but, it was a day or so before it kind of reached up here. And, I remember I was going to Bancroft Middle School. I was a magnet kid, and the school buses got canceled because things were on fire. And so I had to walk home with a buddy of mine, took Santa Monica from Highland all the way to Western. And, we saw like the big Sears on fire that still never reopened, and just, people just wiling out in the streets. It was really an intense sort of thing. And then when I got back down to my neighborhood, I did see, on the corner of Beverly and Normandy, there were 2 fires. There was a Chief Auto Parts that went up, and then there was like a 7-Eleven that was on fire where the Chinatown Express was. And then the liquor store that was owned by a Korean couple or a Korean family, which I was really cool with. I mean, because I grew up going to this liquor store, like they were really nice people. I saw the owner, like, on the roof, kind of like protecting the store because things were getting out of control. And that was, I mean, for me, it was very interesting because they were a really nice family, and like it was weird seeing him in that light as a child. You know what I'm saying? But in the same way, like, it was chaos. So like I get it, but it was a very, that to me is an image that really kind of like stuck with me. Like this person that I knew in like a completely different context, like being kind of forced by what was going on to do something that seemed completely out of character. But that kind of event did shape life for me, like it shaped life for everybody in LA. I mean, I'm a Black male in Los Angeles, like that, the reasons for the uprising and what happened and what continues to happen is very clear. And that's not something that is, going away. So in that way, it kind of like opened that door for my understanding, but the context was already there. Like it was some, that was a dynamic between, between Black males and the police that, like, honestly, like had been drilled in me since I was a much younger child.
Wow, that is so much. I feel like we could just continue talking about that for so much longer. And so I almost feel like regretful moving on to the next question. But just for the sake of time for today, knowing that hopefully we continue to have these conversations. So combining kind of this more your kind of more joyful experiences of growing up and sort of engaging in this sort of interracial kind of, you know, mixed race kind of, as you called it, like space with your friends and your peers, and then seeing kind of these striking things that have like, I guess, just have like stuck with you over the years of the uprising or the unrest. I'm curious how you now, as an adult, kind of engage in sort of intercultural, interracial spaces. I don't know if that's too broad of a question, but I just wonder if you could reflect on how you engage in those spaces.
Well, I mean, honestly, like, I can say my experiences since the uprising inform me more than what happened in the uprising. And honestly, like, the thing that I like the most about Koreatown, and that really kind of stuck with me the most is that it's a real neighborhood in like every sense of the word. So, being part of the neighborhood and being tied to the location was a bigger influence on the way that I interacted with my neighbors than who I was, because like I'd been there for so long. So like I knew everybody's older brothers, I knew everybody's older sisters, like I knew who went to this school and who went to that school. Like I was, especially being like a skater and then later, being, involved in like some of the graffiti crews around, like I had a real intimate knowledge of like, not only like the families and the people that lived in the area, but the spaces also. And my knowledge wasn't tied to, what ethnicity we were. So, I mean, to be totally honest, that's just something I always keep in my back pocket. And like, that's just how I relate to people. And, but that's always, that's not really how the world works at large. So in a lot of ways, you have to, you have to keep it in reserve, but at the same time, you have to, you have to be aware and you have to acknowledge that that's not necessarily how the world is seeing you, which is just what it is. You know what I mean? So like, in a lot of ways, I basically, what's the best way to put it? I react to people as they react to me, and I react to you as a person. And if you react to me in a certain way where there's a negative layer or a negative connotation, or I pick up a tinge of that based on who I am as a person, on my background, on being a Black male in this country, then that's something I react to. But if you don't, that's not something I'm going to react to. I mean, which I'm sure is like that's for most people. I mean, like this isn't like a thing. It's just that growing up in such a dynamic and multicultural space just really I just really was acclimated. It's just not. It's kind of not a big deal. You know what I'm saying? Like in a lot of ways, which is a thing that makes me happy because it's really helped inform how I navigate the world.
Hmm. Thank you so much for that. And I really see the way that's how you navigate the world. And that's always like drawn me to your work even, and just how you carry yourself. So we only have like 2 minutes, unfortunately, but I want to try to squeeze this in real quick. So as a former longtime renter in Koreatown, and as somebody who like started engaging in their art practice in Koreatown, I wonder if you could kind of look into the future of K-Town and sort of like have any thoughts about housing there or culture, whichever one sort of like strikes you for the next 2 minutes.
Well, I mean, I could talk about housing because housing is something that I think is really like close to not only myself personally, but to like my practice. Most of my photography has been documenting the redevelopment, and not just in Koreatown, but in Los Angeles in general. But it started in Koreatown, but it's moved on to Hollywood, South LA, the Valley, all of that. But my mom still lives in Koreatown, and my mom lives in an apartment, and I help my mom out on a weekly basis, and like rent is really high. And she's in a rent control apartment. It's still really high because she got in a couple of years ago where the prices had already gone up. And it's just that it's unfortunate because I think that Koreatown being an affordable place to live contributed to how vibrant of an area and how vibrant of a neighborhood that it is. And that's what encouraged all of that overlap and intersection of like cultures and people and things like that. And then when you take that away, that it loses something. So, I mean, I think that that's pretty much the thing that, kind of bums me out the most about, aside from, the rising rates of people being unhoused and just how hard it is to just do everyday things that used to be easier. I feel like we're moving backwards. Really, I feel like the soul of Koreatown, not like the Koreatown that people think that they are visiting, but the Koreatown that people actually live in. I feel like that like core is in danger because just people are being priced out of it, and all the dope people are moving away. Like, I mean, like, people from everywhere is which makes the area such an interesting place to live.
Thank you so much for that, Quasi. And thank you just for your knowledge about the area. Okay,
All
so
good.
we're going to now introduce our next panelist. Jimmy.
And here we are. Yes. Now, just before we introduce our next panelist, I want to encourage our audience to throw any questions they might have about what we've discussed so far into the Q&A section, which we will absolutely make an effort to get to at the end of this segment. So should you have any questions about anything that has been said or noted so far, by all means, we encourage you to interact with that Q&A segment, which you should see available on your Zoom. Now, with that said, it is my pleasure to introduce Susan Park. Susan, also known as Koreatown Class on Instagram, is the founder and executive director of Asian Americans for Housing and Environmental Justice. As a community organizer and a witness to the evolution of K-Town since 1975, Susan is well-versed in the ways that the lack of language access keeps members of our community from the available resources they desperately need. With that said, I leave the floor to you, Helen, as well as Susan.
Thank you so much. So great to have you, Susan. Just make sure to have your mic on. Thank you so much. The incredible thing about this panel is that we have a breadth of and depth of knowledge about Koreatown. So while Quasi, his formative years started in the 80s and into the 90s, Susan, can you tell us a little bit about your experience of Koreatown in the 70s as a recent immigrant?
So my family moved from Seoul to Los Angeles in January of 1975. I was 5 years old. Back then, Koreatown was a very neglected part of Los Angeles City. What existed in Koreatown was just a few Korean businesses. There was Olympic Market, Kimbanga, VIP Plaza opened later. So Koreatown had moved up from Jefferson Avenue in South Central since like 1968, 67, and just kept moving north. So Koreatown was really just very up and coming. There just was not much to it. Most upwardly mobile facing Korean immigrants at the time did not want to live in Koreatown because it's so high crime, blighted, poor schools. They really wanted the suburban dream in the San Fernando Valley. And there was a sense that if you started off in Koreatown, you would never leave Koreatown. You would just get stuck in Koreatown. So my parents tried to find a place to live in the San Fernando Valley where my mom's older sister lived, but we ended up a couple miles west of Koreatown, just north of Hancock Park, what's now called Central Hollywood. I went to Vine Street Elementary School. This was 11 years after the Civil Rights Act passed. We still had a lot of racist white teachers. First generation of American public school children going to multicultural, multi-ethnic schools, not just Black and white. It was easy for my brothers and I to make friends with the Mexican kids who were also indigenous, and then later Hispanic identifying or Latino, mestizo, white. Just the whole umbrella of being Mexican, because we had rather than kids who we just completely identify as American, because we knew we were just kind of in this crap together. We were the kids of immigrants, and we felt like a physical similarity too. And we were, like Mexican kids at my school, and my brothers and I, Korean kids, were helping our immigrant parents like navigate the world. So, that was like immediate bonding, despite like our teachers not being encouraging of anything. I remember my kindergarten teacher constantly complaining that she had to teach ESL to Korean students and ESL to Spanish speaking students. And this just made her angry all the time. So I think I'm kind of done answering that question.
Thank you for that. And I think in you sharing that background, people can maybe draw a line from that, childhood upbringing to language access. But could you, just for our education, explain what is language access and just why you are so passionate about this issue?
So my father learned how to speak English before coming to America. He spoke conversational English, but that was widely rejected by American society at the time. So I like to talk about language access like I'm peeling an onion. Okay, so first of all, I start with Korean. I am fluent in Korean. I'm high level bilingual. My parents made sure I never forgot Korean. I can read it and write it too. And when you're doing advocacy work, you do advocacy work for people you identify with and people who can identify with you. And then you do the advocacy work for people who are, next to you, with you together. So I start with Korean language access because it's a tier 1 language, tier 1 high priority language for translation in LA City, second only to Spanish. People think just because there are all these Korean signs in Koreatown, the people, Korean speakers are getting language access. No, they are not. They're seeing signs. Those are business signs. Those are commercial signs. They're not getting language access for human and social services, for apprenticeship programs, for educational opportunities. There's a huge number of things that are only in English and then Spanish. They're not in Korean. And then I also mean language access for linguistically marginalized people. That is anyone who is not a white male. Anglo-white male in America. So linguistically marginalized people also include Black Americans who speak in a Black American vernacular, or even those of us who don't, BIPOC who are told you're so articulate, constantly having to code switch, so, having to talk like this in certain spaces, hi, my name is Susan Park, that code switching we have to do. That is so burdensome, So it's language access is really centering people and meeting people where they're at in terms of their linguistic ability. Even not assuming that somebody is a Spanish speaker. They could be, limited English proficient, Spanish speaking in, say, a social or human services space, but they could be indigenous. And Spanish could be their second or third language. So we have to meet people where they're at, listen with our eyes, listen, with people's behavior, find their comfort zone. That is what I'm saying that government and nonprofits and social and human services providers need to do.
Thank you for that. And I think that, when I hear about language access, particularly the way you're talking about it, it's really about like providing people a means to a seat at the table, right? And dialogue
Yes.
and representation and empowerment. So I think that really segues to other aspects of civic issues that you are concerned with. One of them being that before the pandemic, you formed the Asian Americans for Housing and Environmental Justice. And so through that work and just your awareness of the community and the neighborhood in general, I know that you've seen a rise in homelessness in AAPI community, particularly with Koreans in Koreatown. So could you talk a little bit about that, give us some information on that and how perhaps they are not being considered in the larger dialogue about unhoused folks?
So about 10 years ago, I started noticing more homeless Koreans in Koreatown. And then I think it was about 5 years ago, was it Koreatown for All started doing organizing work and activism in Koreatown, and they were completely ignoring the Korean and Asian American Pacific Islanders who were homeless in Koreatown. And I just found that shocking. I just really found that shocking. So, there is a disconnect between Korean Americans who are primarily English speakers and Korean Americans who are primarily Korean speakers. A lot of times we're not in the same spaces. I don't know why people think we all know each other. We don't. Where am I going to go meet Koreans who don't speak English at all? Through my nonprofit or through churches that I don't go to. So we're not a monolith. And, a lot of the homeless Koreans that I've spoken to, most of them do not speak English. A few do, actually. A few are American raised and they speak English well, but for the most part, they don't. But even if they were American raised, they come from multi-generational poverty. Their families were poor in Korea. Their families are poor in America. They work entry-level jobs where they go from one entry-level job to another. They, hop, skip around, never getting a real raise because they never really had a place long enough. And a lot of times, since their families are low income or poor, family emergency, like an illness, a hospital visit, an emergency, a car accident can spiral a family out of control, financially out of control. And sometimes they don't really have a lot of family. They're alone. They came alone, or spouse died. So they're isolated. And no, the Korean church does not solve all the problems. Korean Americans do not all want to go to church. There's also some toxicity to church I won't get into, but it's there. So please do not assume that like Koreans are all being saved by the Korean churches. It's just not true. So yeah, entry level, and then they didn't get access to human and social services. That's the language access piece I'm talking about. They didn't get served by tenants' rights organizations who don't have Korean language services or any other Asian language services.
And I think for because we have a very diverse audience here, they may not really understand the role of the Korean church within, particularly in the diaspora. So I guess just to, well, let me have you maybe just very briefly talk about the Korean church in the context of Koreatown or Korean American life.
Well, I'll talk about the Korean church in terms of their role in homeless outreach in Koreatown. You know, some of the Korean churches, they do some good work, and I've met homeless people who are at Korean churches. They're not necessarily all Korean, it's multi-ethnic too, who do need to believe in a higher power. So, you know, that's up to them. But there are other people who do not want to believe in a higher power. Some of the Korean pastors tell homeless people that it's God's will, that they're supposed to be homeless. They were chosen to be homeless, and they act in ways that disempower homeless people. You know, look, somebody who's Korean and homeless, they don't want prayers. They don't want to be told they're sinners. They want services. They want food. They want a place to live. Okay, that's.
Yeah, thank you. So for my final question for you today, Susan, and again, like with you too, with everybody, I could just talk to you for so much longer. But you referred a little bit a while ago to this perception of Koreans as a monolithic singular voice. And we talked about that in the interview of you as well. Check it out on ktownisok.com. So I wondered, as a case study for how that misperception of us all having a singular voice, as a case study, as I said, could you talk about a few years ago when there was the protest against the homeless shelter that was being planned to be built on Vermont and I think 7th. And there was some protests and things like that. So if you could talk about that a little bit and the role of Korean Americans in that.
Okay, so there were lots of different Korean American factions to that protest who came out for different reasons. One of the biggest reasons was that Herb Wesson, who has a long history with Korean Americans in K-Town, you know, going back to before 1992, has a long, long history with us, did not confer with Koreatown community leaders, organizations, or Korean-speaking residents about the proposed shelter. So there was a faction that felt really insulted, right? If you're dealing with a white neighborhood, you would never try to sneak something like this up on us, right? So there was that faction. And then the ugliest faction, the most vocal and negative and like sort of racist faction, they were hired by real estate developers and real estate companies. Some of them Korean owned, some of them not. And, you know, a lot of people who know Koreatown know this. But that group, that most vocally negative group, was highlighted by Koreatown for All, who weaponized that group against Koreatown residents of being broadly racist. This is a hired group, okay? This is not a civic group. They're hired to say specific things and paid. And then American media, who really didn't talk to Koreatown residents. They just kind of reached out to the Korean Resource Center for a comment. You know, most of the people who work at the Korean Resource Center, they don't live in Koreatown. They don't live in Koreatown. The board members don't live in Koreatown. They're not in touch. A lot of the employees at the time, they live in Orange County. They're not even long-time residents. So, you know, mainstream media wasn't even talking to any Korean people who would know what's going on. So that was like, that really fired me into action. And I texted Koreatown for All, and I Facebook messaged them. I asked them in the 2-3 years at that time that they had been doing outreach, how many Koreans and AAPI homeless people had they done outreach to. And I still save those messages. I kept my receipts. They said 14 to 20. That is a joke. There are hundreds, if not 1,000 or more. So yeah, I'm getting a little impassioned, but yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for your passion, Susan, and just for sharing your knowledge as well. I sadly need to move on to our next panelist, who is Vladimir. de Jesus Santos, and I'd love to introduce him. Vladimir is a Salvadorian American filmmaker and journalist from Koreatown. He also forms one half of the podcast A Fu Yo Rocker, which explores the intersection between race and identity around extreme music in the hood. Vladimir has published several articles related to Cape Town and LA Taco, including Our Communities Depend on Each Other. Olivia in Cape Town is using food to unite Korean and Latino cultures. Welcome, Vlad.
Thank you for that warm welcome. Feel honored to be here.
We are honored to have you, and it comes down to you and me, Vlad. We are rounding out this one-on-one sesh with our panelists.
All right. I just want to say quickly, shout out to everybody who spoke before me, Monica, Bossy, and Susan. Wow, it's a tough acts to follow, honestly. You guys kind of set me up here going last. Susan, thank you so much for everything all the work you've done. That's hearing you speak about, all the community work being done by you, and it's incredible. I just want to say shout out. I really appreciate everything you said.
Right, and so what we'll do is we'll get into a little bit of one of the latest versions of K-Town, we might say. So you are a 90s baby, just as I am, and you came up in K-Town. K-Town is your home. K-Town is this place that you have done a whole lot of ethnographic work on. And before we get into this, what I want to ask you a little bit about is your Salvadorian American experience through K-Town. How did this inform your perspective of LA, and then more specifically, your part of LA in Koreatown? Tell me a little bit about growing up as a 90s Salvadorian American in central Los Angeles through Koreatown.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I think what's interesting is that, socioeconomically, like Kwasi was saying before me, that like Koreatown is has been a place that was affordable for a lot of people, so it was kind of diverse because of that. So many people were able to afford and live in Koreatown because of that, make that move. And for me, I grew up, I was born in '89, grew up in the '90s. I moved to K-Town in '99 when I was 10 years old. Lived in Pico Union, just like a mile, 2 miles away prior to that. I always tell people that we were the first Latino family that moved into our building. And then by the time we moved out 15 years later, there's only one Korean family left in that building. So we got to see that major change in demographics, or at least I did from a young age. But I think it's interesting, because there's a lot of interesting things that were happening in LA at the time. I was born in '89. In the '90s, from in El Salvador, there was a peace accords that were signed in '92. There was a huge wave of people that were being deported to El Salvador, people who actually even were U.S. citizens. I know you mentioned this book that I need to check out about the gangs and the families and people affected in the '90s, specifically in Koreatown. And I think that's yes, that I just ordered it, so I'm getting it in a couple of days. Thank you for that. And I think it's interesting that MS-13, right? The gang is a huge part of Koreatown. La Mara Salvatrucha. It's there, and it was actually founded in right there where Seoul International Park is, right off San Marino and Normandy, and that's where I grew up. There's a lot of interesting kind of layers to being Salvadoran in LA, specifically in Koreatown, people being deported back, taking kind of their American culture back with them, being informed by gangs. I have the devil horns here that's used for extreme music, like in punk and metal, but that's also a gang sign. That's a gang sign used by MS-13.
Wow. Right.
So there's a lot of interesting things happening. The first gang members were Salvadoran rockero fools from the '90s, who just happened to go back home and start a gang that became international. It's one of the smallest countries in the world, and just has such a huge impact. So to answer the roundabout way to answer your question is that it was very interesting to grow up a Salvadoran American in Koreatown. I felt like I felt like it was home always, you know. I felt like we have so many people that are Salvadoran there, that in Central American in general, you know, when you live in such a Mexican dominated culture in LA, you know, then being Central American below that, it feels like Koreatown was always home. I mean, the Salvador corridor is right there. The señoras that were always vending on James and Wood, and well, before that at Ninth and Vermont, you know. So yeah, I got to experience a lot of different things. You know, a lot of things I didn't know about until later. You know, just everything's hindsight's 2020. So I just kind of was a kid, you know, in Koreatown, and drawn to certain things. So certain subgenres and subcultures. So yeah,
Right.
I hope that answers your question.
It absolutely does. And what I'm going to ask you about is harping in a little bit on that youth culture, especially. So this is because in 2019, you started one of my favorite local podcasts ever, A Foo You a Rocker. There's something so specific to this podcast, and if you know, you know, but I'm really happy to be able to cite that all this time later. I want to ask you a little bit about how you were looking at two, quote, subcultures, unquote. That includes Salvadoran American culture, which is not predominant in a city like Los Angeles, as well as heavy metal music, which you spoke a little bit about in your first answer. So tell me a little bit about A Foo You a Rocker and how essentially this captured a specific part of your youth and really documented it for folks such as yourself to keep in mind. Tell me about what led you and your colleague to found this podcast and what it continues to say about LA, because it stands the test of time, certainly for yours truly.
Yeah. It's, you know, it's interesting. I think we always want to see ourselves in storytelling, right? And for me and my friends, we were always, you know, we would go to backyard shows, we would go to shows, you know, shout out the Old School Knitting Factory, the House of Blues, but then also just backyards in South Central, some in East LA, just depending where you were, where you knew somebody that you would be safe, especially in the 90s and early 2000s, you know, it was still very gang informed. So you're not going to be caught like slipping in a neighborhood you didn't grow up in, you know? So music, like in general, with a lot of things, you know, could be very white centric. And that wasn't my experience. I didn't have an experience where I was hanging out with white rocker fools. I was hanging out with black and brown like rocker fools. And fools, I mean, like as a gender inclusive term, you know, it doesn't mean male. It means it means anything, you know. It's non-binary as far as I use it. Fool can be anybody. And you know, I was just like, I remember talking to you briefly, Jimmy, about this, that was a term that we heard about the hood from hood fools, from cholo fools, like a fool, you're a rocker. And it was like a form of perception of perceiving you're also uniform, the color, you wore black, you had long hair, you had crazy hair, you had markings that were also similar to them. You know, they're anti-authoritarian. They're kind of like in a very cliquey way, you know, form. So the cholo fools saw that in you as a rocker fool, and they perceived you. And you could ask anybody who grew up hearing that, they hated it. You know, no one wanted to be perceived. I'm like, hey, I am feeling pain and anger because of socioeconomics that I don't fully understand, and I'm listening to this music that it helps me like do something. It helps me alleviate something. You know, hearing people scream, like the violence, the anger is really just mass sadness. You know, everybody's sad. It's just different ways of expressing it. So the podcast is just like, it was like, I don't know anybody talking about how we grew up. Like, I don't see that in any media. Like, I see a lot of white media talking about punk and metal. I'm like, but where's ours at? And so when we started it, I would shout out, you know, my co-host Alex Bravo, who also grew up in Koreatown. You know, I met him at UCLA, and I was just like, I remember seeing him, and he was wearing an Iron Maiden shirt, and I just was like, "What's up?" Like, and it's something in me like kind of awakened that I hadn't done since I was in middle school. It's like, so cool, you're a rocker, like, because I didn't hear that, I didn't see that in like a predominantly white institution, you know. And so we were just kind of joking around. I think everything that's good starts with joking and fun and joy. And I'm like, actually, no, this is like we should talk about this, man. Like, I know we don't need another podcast centered around two cis dudes, but like, this is an ethnographic project, you know. Like, I've taken classes at UCLA. We could talk about this in an academic way, talk about music, and, you know, make it fun. I was always the kid in any class that wanted to turn in a video project because I didn't want to write. So this is my kind of version of that. I was like, this would be a fun project. Let's just do it. Let's listen to the music we want to listen to and talk to who we want to talk to. And that way the hood could see itself reflected in itself. And it's just like kind of like a, a historical document in that way. So that's how we started it. And that's what was our intention. And it was just like, just to talk about ourselves and have our own conversation, especially in Koreatown, which is so gnarly, it's so diverse, endless stories.
Right. It really makes me think about how this panel has centered so much around language and accessibility through language just as well, and including the terms that we use to engage with one another. I remember one podcast episode between you and your co-host where you note that, hey, like, everybody's a fool. Like, everybody's a fool at some point. Foo comes from fool, and everyone is foolish at some point. And I just thought, click, click, click. This is absolutely right on point. Now, with respect to this, you've written for years about Salvadoran American culture in Los Angeles. And when I speak with one of my peers or another, they note that there's something special about this cultural moment for Salvadoran Americans, maybe just in general, that is in the US, but certainly in Los Angeles. Can you tell us a little bit about what themes or aspects of the Salvadoran American experience need to be captured if this is a moment, and what we need to continue discussing or honing in on when it comes to this very particular experience that also affects many people in Pico Union, K-Town, and beyond in LA?
Yeah, that's a big question. That's a question that begs like a discussion about transnational politics, like, why are we here? We're part of diaspora as Salvadorans, like, we're having a moment, right? So, but El Salvador has like always been a big topic because it's like they say Central America is the United States backyard. And if we know the history of world politics, the US, and the US being like a huge imperial power that's anti-communist, that's anti, like, it has well documented cases of like assassinating left-wing leaders and like fighting democracy any way they can and installing their own puppet dictators. It's just one of the many countries that the US has sent military aid to fight radical, like, popular movements. So because of that, it's always a topic, and it's one of the last areas where US imperialism is really being fought still. There's still grassroots movements. I mean, the democracy in El Salvador is younger than me. I'm older than the US democracy, than the constitution in El Salvador right now. I'm 34. And I think that's very interesting, and we're here and kind of talking, and people who are Salvadoran American are, especially those that are disaffected and not following the popular, like, right-wing conservatism that is so popular in our country, in our homeland, especially authoritarianism. We're here, like, kind of, what do we do? We got to talk. We got to eat food. We got to discuss history. Like, we got to talk about displacement. So, there's always something going on in El Salvador. It's just because it's an important marker of like U.S. imperialism, and it's a reflection of what is currently happening. And with the current president, there's a lot of attention by other, like, right-wing governments from around the world, that are praising him, and then there's a reaction from people who can see that there's very fascist elements to this new government and presidency. So yeah, I think those people who are interested in claiming their own histories and authoring their own narratives, and I think that everybody's here trying to claim something, claim a piece of a land or a home, in some type of way, whatever that means. So I don't know if that's getting a little too heady or spacey, but I think it's always a topic. It's always going to be a topic, and it's just, this is our reaction. This is our reaction as people who grew up in the 90s, who have seen both governments, right and left wing, and now seeing this new government, and we're just reflecting our times.
Right. I mean, at the very least, it excites me about all of the analysis ahead for young people of the diaspora, young working professionals included in that, because Los Angeles, as a city for so many of us, is probably a better position than any other city for discussions on especially Central America and what was formerly known as the United States' backyard, where it's at now, where it's headed, and how young people in between inform that process or not. And not just young people, but our parents, our grandparents, the whole community that we know and that we care for with respect to this. Now, I am so thankful for this chat between us, and I'm also excited to get into a collective discussion with the rest of our panelists through the remainder of the time. We've also got some great questions that we saw in the Q&A that we will do our best to get to. However, know that if we don't get to those Q&A sections this evening, we will be addressing them going into our podcasting, including a recap that we'll be getting into very soon. But for now, it's my pleasure to reintroduce everyone. Welcome back. And I want to pose the question, if it's okay with all of you, about these audio leaks 1 year later. Vlad said something really interesting, which was that sometimes a joke or something that is harmful or something that is even violent can lead to all these other incarnations, all these other manifestations. Koreatown is Oaxacan Korean is certainly an embodiment of that. And so what I want to pose to you all is the question, especially after this discussion, about the leaked audio recordings. What do we make of them 1 year later? What's changed and what hasn't? And Monica, if it's okay, I'd like to start with you, and then we will go from there, if that's all right.
Well, I wasn't surprised with the leak audios because, like I said, like I was just kind of used to hearing how they identify the Oaxacans, and I think that's why the Oaxacan people and the Korean people developed such solidarity with each other, because we kind of grew up together. Everybody was migrating, coming to Koreatown, and we grew up together. We learned together. We kind of were there for one another. And when those leak audio happens, I think it was good in a sense that it was exposed of how people really think, like, you know, and at the same time, like personally, when those happened, like I said, my mom wasn't really with me on like learning, and you know, even though I now identify, she still was just kind of like, but when those audios happened, she was really quiet all day, and she came with, when there was a protest, she came with some carton, like some like boards and markers, and she said, go, like go. And I get emotional every time I say this because it was the first time she kind of said, welcome to my world. Through good and through bad, you're indigenous, and go speak for us. Because it was the first time she kind of gave me permission to be indigenous. And she said, here's the cardboard, here's the markers, go. And I think it also brought lots of togetherness with the older folks whom I grew up with. Like I was the only child in the 80s, and the young generation of Oaxaca, you know, self-identifying Oaxacan indigenous youth. So it did change a lot of things in good ways, I feel, for in my point of view. More visibility, more youth organizing, and it's continuous. So I'm grateful for that.
Susan, you have your mic on, and it would be our pleasure to hear thoughts on this question just as well.
I was not surprised. I was not surprised. Within a day or two, Odelia from my CLO, a coalition of indigenous people from central Mexico to the coast of Costa Rica, invited me to speak at the big Oaxacan rally that happened at City Hall. And we were inclusive of, you know, the other aspect was, you know, the Koreans don't live in Koreatown; they live somewhere else. We're extractive in our own neighborhoods, right? That's pernicious stereotype against Asians. And then we also addressed, you know, the really Machiavellian machinations against Black political power, trying to usurp that. That was just, but just anecdotally, because I was in, my nonprofit is in alternatives to incarceration. It's a LA County program, mostly Black and brown, and then a couple Asians, me, And I do work with a lot of government offices on language access and being super inclusive. After that, I can clearly tell that there were people who identified with the Latino political class, right? Specific political class, who really were like, oh, holy caca. This has been exposed. We have to be more inclusive. So I did feel a lot of walls going down. Like people were just like, oh no, of course you're gonna have Korean with Chinese. We have to work with Black Americans, Indigenous. Of course. So there was a lot of like kind of cleansing. It was good. It was healing. I think it was healing for people. Thank you. I'm done.
Quasi, glad you're invited just as well.
Yeah, no, I think that for me, it was really a kind of sign about how on a higher level, like people don't really understand the way that a lot of communities and like neighborhoods work just on a street level. And, so they make these broad-based kind of, generalizations about, about not only the people they live there and, show them in a negative light, but also, it really comes down to power and trying to come up with ways to extract power. And I think that was kind of the underlying thing with me. It was not a surprise at all. I mean, honestly, that's not, that perspective, I think, is something that's very prominent in LA politics, I would assume, but just in culture and in community. I mean, you don't have to look hard for that perspective. I mean, that's something that, growing up in LA, in a lot of non-predominantly Black neighborhoods also, like, that's something I'm really aware of. But I also know that that's not necessarily like the defining characteristic. So it was good to kind of like have it get out there and like have people discuss it in a way that was, not like secretive, but in a way of like, wow, that's not really the perspective we're trying to come from, or that's not the community we're trying to build. So like, let's try to like counteract that. So, I mean, a year on, I think that the positivity that's come out of it has outweighed the negative that, spawned it. You know what I'm saying? Especially for a place as small as K-Town, because it's small. And like, it doesn't, if a couple organizations start kind of working with each other, or if a couple people start seeing things a little bit differently, the connection can have an outsized effect on like how people can live and things like that. It can't fix LA, but I mean, from like a neighborhood perspective, like you can maybe feel the vibe shift a little bit.
Glad.
That's great. Yeah, I think I'm gonna echo what everybody said. Of course, not surprised. I thought it was kind of funny, actually. I thought it was funny they got caught. I was like, wow, they're kind of dumb. Like, of course, we know that these people are talking this. We've experienced, institutional racism. Like, we know when we feel something feels off. You're like, I feel like I'm being blocked by something here. I don't know. So just to hear them say that, I was just like, in their casual conversation, like how you would casually talk about a movie with your friends or say your point of view. There was, I was kind of like, I found it refreshing. I was like, oh look, it's like, so what we always thought. They're so candidly talking about how grotesque they are, and I think what Quasi you said, it's great. You're right. The positive response has outweighed like the negative aspects of it. I think we all followed what happened, and we were hoping that Kevin De Leon would step down, and he hasn't. Kind of like that's kind of like one of the big things. We're just kind of seeing how local politics really are kind of messed up. And I think for me, it's something that I think people who are like radical have always, especially if you're ethnically in a minority, racially in a minority, you want to see yourself, you're like, oh, maybe in a position of power or something. And then Latinos, as we know it as the group, it's like the blanket term for all people, have always wanted like to have brown people represent them with Spanish last names and stuff. And I just hope that people would see that like representation has its limits, because like it doesn't matter if they sound and look exactly like you. Like, not all skin folk are kinfolk. And I'm like, these people don't stand for what we stand for. And seeing people in this panel, I'm like, I feel like we're all kind of in the same like-minded, nature, where we care. Community is so important to us. We care about our neighbors. We like, when that happened, I feel like it brought everybody in Koreatown together, because no one's prouder than people who are from Koreatown, I feel, when I lived in New York, people were like, we get it, you're from Koreatown, you guys like chill out. So I
Get it?
yeah, and I get that all the time. It's hard for me not to be in that mode, but I think we care so much about everybody, even like our houseless neighbors to, we're hoping from even people who are more privileged that they can kind of get what we're trying to put down, like that they're like, they can kind of mess with like the more radical, more cool, like kind, loving things that we're compassionate things that we're trying to like put down, or put out like that vibe, and that comes from so many people already who come from like ethnic enclaves, also like super indigenous minded, like these are all like super common and powerful things that bring us together, like I told you, Jimmy, I saw a tweet that said that the antithesis to white supremacy is community. So I feel like we saw the response. We saw the white supremacy, we're like, oh yeah, it's there, and then it's like, look, we're here now. So that was cool.
Helen, your mic is unmuted, so I want to invite you to perhaps take us home.
Yeah.
It's wild to think that we have just a handful of minutes left, but that is how these discussions go.
Yes, I would love for us to end with this one question from Eric, one of our audience members. I think it's a great one to end on, and maybe we could have each person from our panel speak for maybe like a minute each. And the question is, what do each of you think about Koreatown's future? Where do we go from here, and what are the most pressing needs of this community? So pick whatever aspect of that question really compels you. And maybe we could start with Monica, if you don't mind.
I see Koreatown's future just becoming better, becoming more united. And it's not just Koreans and Oaxacans, like Central Americans, like it's really diverse. And this is why I agreed to speak here, because even growing up, like on the streets, I'm playing Chinese jump rope with a Black kid and a Chinese kid, and we play tag, and it's almost like I'm seeing that again, but as adults, that community, and I really have lots of hope for Koreatown's future, because it's truly a melting pot. And yeah, I mean and what are the most pressing needs? I think just accessibility for those that, like Susan spoke, language access, cultural programs, parks for our children. So, just infrastructure, like stuff like that. So.
Very cool. What about you, Quasi?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, I wish I could tell the future, but things get, it's been a wild couple of years, so I don't make predictions anymore. But I think that like I see a lot of like hope and kind of like optimism in like younger kids. Like, I have like two young daughters, like, they're part of like the Koreatown, community. I don't live in Koreatown anymore, but my mom and my in-laws do. My wife's from Koreatown, so like, we're out there. And so like I feel like, I see a lot of, inspiration and like potential and kind of like how they come to define it. One of the things that, kind of really became apparent, like listening to everyone talk, is that, especially like Susan, is like how new Koreatown is in its current form. Like this is kind of a recent thing. And so like it'll be interesting to see how that kind of passes on and transfers to kids whose parents grew up there and who were like born like in the area, that are, from all over, and kind of like what version of Koreatown they make. So I would say I'm interested to see that. But that's also like, in contrast to, the phenomenal onslaught of problems, economically that we're facing as a city. And that, so it's like, it's not all roses, but those problems need to be addressed like in general. But I'm somewhat optimistic, because kids do things that like you can't imagine. And so it's kind of cool to see them just do those sorts of things, like, and just kind of wow out.
So cool. And you, Susan?
I would say Koreatown is what I've been talking about for a long time, like leading up to 1992. You can't really expect the first generation of people, diverse people who meet each other as adults, to come to an understanding. You can expect that from the second generation, and now we have more third generation who grew up together. We grew up sitting next to each other in class, playing jump rope together, understanding each other from childhood. And I think that's where Koreatown is like a really beautiful kind of, island space representation of all this diversity in LA. And, without those tapes, we wouldn't be having this conversation here. So that's another positive outcome. But the rent is too damn high in Koreatown. It has to go down. Market forces, if market forces were really allowed to play itself out instead of like tax breaks and blah, 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 the rent would be the rent has to go down, because without working people of all different backgrounds, there is no Koreatown. It's going to be a corporate shell. It's going to be like what Vegas Koreatown makes no sense. So thank you. I'm done.
And finally, you, Vlad.
Yeah, I think what Susan said is great. I mean, I think that there's to jump on that, I think there's a Koreatown happening somewhere else, like where there's low income possibilities, where there's migrant people meeting each other for the first time, different cultures, like Koreatown could go the way of like Boyle Heights, where it's like it has a strong community, like history, and it has like first generation of immigrants, like Black folks, Japanese folks, and then Mexican Americans, all that stuff. It could go that way, and then it's like people fighting to rent increases, fighting to keep that pocket alive. It's also really small. K-Town isn't that big, so it could go that way. I mean, there's so many people moving to K-Town all the time, like I left for a year. I came back, it was completely different. I was like, I don't need, it's like, so it was so gentrified, but there's different type of people, there's like artists, there's like, it became even more multicultural with transplants. So I think it's going to be okay. I think there's always going to be youth. There's always going to be cool, new, rambunctious people. It's always going to be awesome. It's like, I always tell people what it was the lead singer of The Who, what he said when he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And they were asking the question, should Run DMC be considered rock and roll group? Should this, hip hop was just coming up. And he was like, you don't have to like it. Just get the hell out of the way. So I feel like that's the way, we can't be old heads. We can't guard stuff. And like, things are going to change. It's always going to change, So I hope that we are having cooler discussion like this, 30 years from now, more people. So I'm always hopeful. I think, we've survived colonization. We're still here. So we're still gonna be here. Free Palestine.
Wow. I am so moved. I don't know about you, Jimmy, but I'm moved. I'm inspired. I feel like full from this amazing conversation. It's just like a possibility of things to come. So thank you so much, every single one of you panelists, to just be here and to speak your mind and to share this space with us.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you to our panelists, and thank you also to our audience, our attendees. I was looking at the numbers steadily through the evening, and those who came stayed, and we really so appreciate this. As we get into the closing minutes of our presentation this evening, we want to uplift K-Town is Okay, the podcast, because, let me be the first to say it here, we invite each of our panelists onto this podcast to be our guests and to say more behind the questions that we just opened for ourselves, but certainly for the rest of our community this evening. We invite you to join us at K-Town is Okay, the podcast, so that you can say more and talk a little further, because time this evening was about introducing more and more people to your voices, and so it would be our pleasure to follow up with you in that. We also want to encourage y'all to contact myself as well as Helen H. Kim to let us know what we didn't answer today, what we still have more to say about, even after the notes we have created so far. Tell us about your side of K-Town. Tell us about your K-Town story, what we maybe slightly alluded to during the course of our discussion, or what we altogether missed, because that happens too. Clearly, though, in community and time with each other, we discover more. That's exactly what we've done just this evening, and we look to do that further as the days go on, but we are going to need your support. We're going to need you to visit ktownisok.com. We're going to need you to follow K-Town is okay on IG and Facebook. Also, FYI, this was recorded live on the Facebook page for K-Town is okay. So if you want to forward it along to your friends, family, and networks, by all means. And then I also want to encourage you to donate to Quien es tu Vecindario, the 501c3 organization that produced this event. Donate so that we have more of these talks and so that we have more panelists and more of the community members who we know we have to see. We have just scratched the surface of all that K-Town is and can still be this evening. But we're excited to move full steam ahead towards all that awaits us, but we're going to need your support. So check out that donation link, check out our website to see other opportunities to support this project and then some. And with that said, I think that rounds us out this evening, unless I've missed anything else. You let us know, Nuna.
Oh, Dongzeng, thank you. No, this was incredible. You said everything. I am with you. And I guess one thing I will say to our audience is that I'm sure you've just gotten a taste of how amazing each and every one of our panelists are. So you will be getting an email tomorrow or over the weekend, just introducing them a little bit further and giving you ways to engage with them. So you will have an opportunity to continue to follow the work that they're doing. So thank you again, panelists. Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you, Richard. And thank you, everybody, for being here with us. This has been really, really special. I would even say sacred space that we shared together. Thank you.
All right, everyone. Good night.
Bye.
Thank you, Jimmy, Helen,
Annyeong.
Richard. Thank you for everything. Thank you for putting this together.
Absolutely. Bye.
Bye.